Hello, my name is Ona Marie Judge. I was born in 1773, or was it 1774? I'm not quite sure. See, my birth was never recorded because I was an enslaved African owned by the Washingtons. My mother is Betty. She was a seamstress of Martha's. My father is Andrew Judge. He was an indentured servant who was also a tailor. He was from England. He was a white man. My mother and my father worked together for the Washington family. I have an older brother, Austin, who is 15 years older than I am. Martha Washington chose me at the age of 10 to be her hand servant, which meant I was to be trained to take care solely of her. If she needed her hair brushed, I brushed her hair. If she needed to change, I changed her clothes for her. I was always by her side. I was 16 years old when George Washington became president, and I had to leave my mother and my sisters to go to New York, to the presidential mansion. And that was the first time that I ever left Mount Vernon, the place that I was born. I was very fortunate to have my brother Austin by my side. I remember the day. It was Saturday, May 21st, 1796, when I gained my freedom by escaping the home of the Washingtons in Philadelphia. The presidential mansion was only in New York for a little while, and they decided, I can't remember how long, and they decided to move it to Philadelphia. And it was there that I learned of the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. In the state of Pennsylvania, if you brought slaves in, slave owners had to register their slaves. After 6 months of being in Pennsylvania, those enslaved Africans were freed. If you were born enslaved in Pennsylvania, you became an indentured servant until the age of 28. And I also found out that Martha was going to give me to her granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis. She was marrying Thomas Law, an Englishman who had been previously married and had 3 children of Indian descent. I wasn't a fan of Eliza Parke Custis, and I didn't want to live under her thumb. I've known Eliza for a very long time. She's a spoiled little brat. I would rather choose death than live under her thumb. So I gained my freedom. I gained my freedom Saturday, May 21st, while the Washingtons were having dinner. See, Hercules made their favorite meals, and I'm sure they asked for seconds. Well, I left that house and never turned back. I was not going to return. See, I don't know how to read, but I remember the directions from Richard Allen. Richard Allen was a chimney sweeper. He was also a cobbler. He helped me in my escape. I remember the night that I left Philadelphia so clearly. I followed the directions given to me by Richard Allen. I got on that boat. I didn't know it then, but it was called the Nancy. And I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but Captain John Bowles was the captain of that boat. I gathered what I could from that home, and I followed those directions as clearly as I remembered. I got on that boat. I didn't have any idea where I would end up. This is where I came, right here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And more secrets. I was met by Palm Springs. I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. He was another man that saved my life. This is the home of Tobias Lear. He was the tutor to Martha's grandchildren, Nellie and Washi, but he was also George Washington's private secretary. He lived down in Mount Vernon in Virginia, After the Revolutionary War, George Washington took my brother Austin with him and many others on a victory tour of all 13 colonies. This was one of the stops. I imagine George and Tobias Lear having tea in the front room here. My brother went out, taking care of the boat, making sure that George had everything that he needed, but he also met the Black community here in Portsmouth. He met people like Pomp Springs and Cyrus Bruce and Prince and Cuffy Whipple. Tobias also played an integral part with helping Martha understand the aspects of the gradual abolition law of 1780. My mother named my younger sister Philadelphia after that gradual abolition act of 1780. She was born in 1780. It was kind of her way of being a little defiant, letting people know that word was spreading about this act and their freedom was almost in sight. We are here at the South Ward Meeting House here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where I married my husband, Jack Stains. It was in January 1797 where I married Jack Stains. He was a sailor, and that was a very dangerous job, but it was important to us that we have our marriage documented. Reverend Samuel Haven was the one that married us. In the African culture, it's really important that we have our marriage documented. So if Jack died at sea, the money that was owed to him would go to his family. But getting our marriage certificate was not an easy task. After I escaped, George had put out ads in the local papers saying that I had absconded from the White House. One day while I was walking the streets of Portsmouth, I noticed Eliza Langdon. See, I had known Eliza Langdon. Her father was a senator here in New Hampshire. They had visited Mount Vernon a few times. She spotted me in the street. She immediately told her father. Senator Langdon wrote a letter to George saying that I was seen here on the streets in Portsmouth. And George made contact with Joseph Whipple, who was the customs agent. He lived at 599 Middle Street, and that's where his office was. So he was right here in town. He tricked me in order to make contact with me. See, I answered an ad for a house servant, and I wanted a job, and I felt that I could do this job. Under false pretenses, I met with Joseph Whipple. At first, I thought it was for a job in his home, but after speaking with him, I realized he was trying to get me back to the Washingtons. But I stood my ground. There was no way I was going to go back, but I didn't tell him that. I falsely promised him that I would meet him at the docks the very next day to be shipped back to Mount Vernon, but I didn't go. When Jack and I tried to apply for our marriage certificate, we were denied here in Portsmouth. So we went to Greenland, New Hampshire, and we got a certificate. And so we were able to get married legally. Behind me stands the home of Jonathan and Mary Warner. They too held slaves. 4 in particular were 4 African men: Peter, Frank, Cato, and John Jack. Cato and Peter signed the Petition of Freedom 1779, requesting the end of slavery. It was given to the state legislature. They set it aside. Didn't really go anywhere, and it was put in a local paper as an amusement piece. John Jack was married to Phyllis Jack. She was a free woman, a free African woman, and she was a property owner. About 8 miles from here in Greenland, New Hampshire was where she lived. The house was small and on some swamp land. See, she was freed by her owner, and he gave her that house with that land. On Saturday nights, John Jack would walk the 8 miles to her home, but he was always here Monday morning to report for work. Work, no. That isn't the best word to be using. They too saved my life. When Burwell Bassett, on his second attempt, he was going to kidnap me. Burwell Bassett was the nephew of Martha Washington. I got word from Cyrus Bruce because Burwell Bassett was staying at Senator John Langdon's house, and Cyrus overheard them talking. Now, I don't know if Senator John Langdon, who by then had freed his slaves and hired them as paid workers on his property. So I don't know if Senator John Langdon or if it was Cyrus Bruce that made the decision to contact me on that night. Burwell Bassett was said to come to my house and kidnap me and my daughter Eliza. I had a young child then. She was my first. She was about a year old. So the night that Cyrus Bruce came to my house, I hired someone locally with a cart, and we gathered our belongings and left. And we went to Phyllis Jack's house in Greenland. Jack, my husband, was out at sea, so I had to wait for him to come back. I am standing at the site of the former home of Pomp and Candace Spring. They were a married couple. They were free. They were African. They were successful in this community. They were married in November of 1793. See, November is a favorable time of year to get married. It was after autumn's harvest and before winter's butchering, and the roads were frozen, making easy travel for their guests. I don't know when Pomp and Candace were freed, but something tells me with a name like Pomp, his mother wouldn't have given him that name. It was more of a pet name. The thing about this house was what was in it. They had curtains over the windows, which was not very popular then. They also had extra chairs and extra silverware, plates and cups. Some might say they were part of the Underground Railroad. I cannot confirm or deny that. And it's a secret that Pomp met me at the docks and took me here until I could get myself established here in Portsmouth. And it was kind of rare for a black man to be held in high regard, even with the white community here in Portsmouth. Pomp was a self-made man. He and his wife and his mother that lived with them in this home, she was not well, but he was a baker. And he would take his goods around the city and sell them, even at the docks. He was held in high regard, not only with the black community here, but the white elite. In fact, when Pomp died in 1807, he had an obituary in the local paper. He and his wife were also buried at North Church Cemetery. That wasn't something that was well known. Pomp died in 1807. He left a will behind. A will is very important in the African culture. It was to make sure that his family was taken care of upon his passing. But unfortunately, after he died, she died 4 months later without a will. And all of his things were inventoried. And people were quite amazed at what he had accumulated with his success.